My fiancé laughed in my face and said, "It's so cute that you get jealous when I meet my ex. It seems you're not cut out to be a husband yet. Just consider me practice." I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I remained completely silent. A few days later, all her belongings were packed into boxes, loaded into my truck, and dropped off directly inside her ex-boyfriend's living room. Before we get into exactly how I executed the cleanest, quietest breakup in history, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Story Siren. We share stories about self-respect, enforcing absolute boundaries, and the quiet power of walking away. Now, let's get into the details. My name is Nalan. I am 33 years old and I work as a commercial delivery driver in Columbus, Ohio. Most of my days start before the sun comes up. I load my truck around 6 o'clock in the morning and spend the rest of the day moving heavy packages across different sectors of the city. It is not glamorous work, but it pays my bills, keeps me in shape, and keeps my schedule highly predictable. I met my fiancée, Violet, a little over 3 years ago. She is 29 and works as a baker at a popular local cafe that gets busy before sunrise. Her shifts usually start at 4 o'clock in the morning, which means most days she is already at work, covered in flour, before I even wake up. We got engaged last winter after living together for about a year and a half. The apartment is technically mine, since I signed the lease and paid the deposit long before we met, but we split the monthly rent and utilities evenly. We had been slowly planning a small, intimate wedding for next fall. On the surface, our life was pretty ordinary. My job kept me out on the road most of the day. Violet worked brutal early hours but loved what she did. Our evenings were usually quiet. Dinner at home, sometimes a movie, sometimes meeting friends on the weekends. But there was one constant, irritating detail that never quite disappeared from our relationship: her ex-boyfriend. His name is Gabriel. According to Violet, they dated for a couple of years before breaking up not long before she met me. She always described it to me as an amicable breakup. Just two people realizing they were better off as friends. At first, I did not question it. People have history. Sometimes things just don't work out romantically. That part seemed normal enough. What started to feel strange and eventually highly disrespectful was how casually Gabriel stayed heavily involved in her life. His name came up in our conversations way more often than you would expect for an ex. Sometimes it was random comparisons. Gabriel loved this restaurant. Gabriel and I used to do this on Sundays. A comment about how Gabriel always understood her stressful bakery schedule better than anyone. The first time I pointed out that she mentioned him a lot, Violet reacted like I had just said something completely ridiculous. She laughed, rolled her eyes, and said, "Confident men are not bothered by old relationships, Nalan." So I let it go. I didn't want to be the insecure, controlling fiancé. Still, over the past few months, something about the situation kept bothering me. Not in a dramatic, paranoid way. Just enough that I started paying much closer attention to her behavior. Violet still met Gabriel for coffee every few weeks. She insisted it was entirely harmless. Just two people who stayed friends after a breakup. Then, about 2 weeks ago, she said something during dinner that fundamentally changed how I looked at everything. We were eating at the kitchen table. She didn't yell. She wasn't angry. She barely even looked up from scrolling on her phone when she said it. She told me it was adorable how jealous I got whenever she went to see Gabriel. Then she added with a little smirk that reactions like mine made it pretty clear I was not husband material yet. "You're just not quite there, Nalan," she said, taking a bite of her food. "Just consider this practice." I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice. But that was the exact moment I stopped thinking about our wedding. I did not react to what Violet said that night. There was no explosive argument. I finished my dinner, rinsed my plate in the sink, and went to bed at my normal time because I still had a heavy truck to load at 6 o'clock in the morning. But the comment stayed with me during my entire route the next day. Delivery driving gives you a lot of quiet time to think. Hours in traffic, long stretches between stops, and absolutely no one around to interrupt your thoughts or tell you you're overreacting. By mid-morning, looking out through the windshield at the highway, I had already made a quiet, permanent decision. I was not going to argue with her about Gabriel anymore. I was not going to defend whether or not I was husband material. I was simply going to stop moving forward with the wedding, and with her. The first thing I did was park the truck and check the notes app I had saved in my phone. Violet liked planning the fun aesthetic things for the wedding, but I was the one keeping track of the actual logistics. The deposits, the vendor contacts, the venues, the catering options. We had a small photographer she liked, and she planned to use the bakery she worked at for the cake. Most of it was still in the early planning stages. Nothing huge had been paid yet, but a few small holding deposits were already sitting out there on my credit card. During my lunch break in the cab of the truck, I started making calls. The venue coordinator answered first. I told her politely that we needed to cancel the tentative reservation. She asked if everything was all right, and I kept it simple. Plans changed, I said. No need to hold the date anymore. She confirmed the cancellation and said the small holding deposit would not be refunded, which I expected. I told her that was perfectly fine. Next was the photographer Violet liked. That one was even simpler since we had only scheduled a consultation and hadn't signed a contract yet. By the time my delivery route ended that afternoon, 3 different wedding-related plans were quietly, permanently gone. I did not tell Violet. There was no reason to yet. That evening, she came home from the bakery smelling like powdered sugar and espresso beans. She dropped her bag on the chair and immediately started talking about a new pastry idea they were testing at work. Gabriel came up again somewhere in the middle of the story. Apparently, he had stopped by the cafe that morning. Violet mentioned it the exact same way someone would mention running into a neighbor at the grocery store. Then she gave me a small smirk and said I shouldn't worry my pretty little head about it, because she knew I got sensitive about that kind of thing. I nodded and kept eating my dinner. She thought the conversation from the night before had ended with her winning the argument and establishing dominance in the relationship. What she did not realize was that there was no argument anymore. The wedding she was still casually talking about was already starting to disappear, piece by piece. Over the next few days, I continued handling things quietly. Most people assume ending an engagement is one massive, dramatic moment. A big confrontation, yelling, crying, someone storming out into the rain. Real life usually moves much slower than that, especially when logistics are involved. And logistics were exactly what I was thinking about. The next step was the engagement ring. It was not some giant, flashy diamond, but it still cost enough that I did not want to just throw the money away. I had bought it from a local, family-owned jeweler about 5 months earlier. Before starting my route one morning, I stopped by the shop to ask about their return policy. The woman at the counter remembered me immediately. Small stores tend to remember people who buy engagement rings. I kept the explanation simple. Plans changed, and I wanted to know my options. The official return window had technically passed, but since the ring was still in perfect condition and purchased recently, they offered me store credit or a partial cash refund minus a restocking fee. I took the refund. That conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes. When I walked back out to my delivery truck, the engagement ring that Violet still wore every single day was already financially undone. That evening, she came home in an unusually good mood. Apparently, Gabriel had come into the cafe again that morning. Violet said it casually while pulling a tray of leftover pastries from her bag and placing them on the kitchen counter. She laughed while telling the story like it was something mildly entertaining. According to her, one of the other bakers had jokingly asked if Gabriel was her boyfriend because of how often he stopped by just to see her. Violet thought that was hilarious. Then she looked at me with that same smug, superior expression I had seen before and said something that stuck in my head like a nail. She said, It must drive you crazy knowing other people still assume Gabriel and I belong together." She didn't say it in a cruel, shouting way. She said it like she was poking a caged animal with a stick, just testing how much she could get away with before I snapped. Emotional triangulation, keeping me off balance so she felt desired. I did not react. I grabbed one of the croissants from the box, took a bite, and nodded like the story barely registered in my brain. Inside, though, the decision I had made earlier in the week kept settling deeper into concrete. By that point, the wedding was already gone. The ring was financially undone, and Violet was still acting like the only problem in our relationship was my supposed jealousy. She had absolutely no idea I was already working on the final step. By the end of that week, I had already made up my mind about exactly how the situation was going to end. I just needed to handle it cleanly. The main thing was the apartment. Like I said earlier, the lease was entirely in my name. Violet moved in about a year and a half ago after her previous place raised the rent. We split expenses evenly, but legally, the place was still mine. That mattered because it meant I did not have to negotiate living arrangements or break a lease once the engagement was over. The opportunity came the following Tuesday. Violet had one of her long, double bakery shifts that day. She usually left the apartment around 3:30 in the morning and did not get back until mid-afternoon. That gave me most of the day. I took the day off from work. Once she left, I made a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes just to think through the exact order of operations. No drama, just steps. First, I grabbed a stack of empty moving boxes from the storage closet down the hall. Then, I started going room by room. I packed only Violet's things, the clothes from her side of the closet, the shoes from the rack near the door, her massive makeup bag from the bathroom, the stack of baking books she kept next to the couch, her laptop charger, her spare blankets, the small potted plants she kept on the windowsill. Nothing was thrown around in anger. Nothing was damaged. Everything was folded or packed carefully. I am not a vindictive person. I am a practical one. By late morning, I had 6 heavy boxes lined up by the front door. The last step required a short drive. Gabriel lived about 15 minutes away in a small townhouse complex on the east side of the city. I knew the exact address because Violet had mentioned visiting there more than once when they grabbed coffee nearby. So, I loaded the 6 boxes into the back of my truck and drove over. I knocked on the door. When Gabriel answered, he looked confused for about 2 seconds. Then, he saw the stack of boxes behind me. I kept the conversation simple, polite, and incredibly calm. I told him Violet would probably be staying with him now. I said her things were in my truck, and I was dropping them off so she would not have to worry about moving them later. Gabriel stared at me like he was trying to figure out if I was joking. I was not. Within 20 minutes, every single box was sitting just inside his entryway. I didn't ask him any questions. I didn't accuse him of anything. I just dropped the cargo and left. I drove home after that. Violet still had about 4 hours left in her shift, and for the first time in a while, the apartment felt peacefully quiet again. Violet usually got home from the bakery sometime between 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock in the afternoon, depending on how busy the cafe was. That day, I was sitting at the kitchen table when I heard her car pull into the lot. Everything inside the apartment was already handled. Her clothes were gone. Her personal things were gone. The plants she liked were gone. Even the extra baking tools she kept in one of the cabinets were boxed and dropped off earlier that morning. The place looked noticeably lighter. When she opened the front door, the first thing she said was that the kitchen smelled weirdly empty without the usual bread and sugar smell she brought home on her clothes after work. Then she stopped talking. It took about 3 seconds for her to notice. Her shoes were gone from the rack by the door. The coat she usually threw over the dining chair was gone. The stack of bakery books next to the couch was missing. She turned slowly and looked at me. At first, she assumed I had cleaned or reorganized something. Then she walked quickly into the bedroom. I stayed at the table and waited. About 10 seconds later, she came back into the living room moving much faster. Her face was already tightening in profound confusion. She asked where her things were. I told her calmly that they had been delivered earlier. That was the exact word I used. Delivered. She blinked at me like the sentence had not fully processed in her brain yet. Then she asked, "Delivered where?" I told her the address. "Gabriel's place." For a moment she just stared at me. Then the questions started coming all at once, rapid fire. Why would I do that? What kind of stupid joke was this? Was I seriously trying to prove some kind of jealous, toxic point? I let her finish. Once she stopped talking and ran out of breath, I explained the situation in the simplest way possible. I told her she had made it crystal clear that Gabriel was still a vastly important part of her life. She had also made it clear to my face that she thought I was not husband material and that I was just practice. So, I solved both problems at the exact same time. Her belongings were already safely at Gabriel's house. The wedding plans and venue were canceled earlier in the week. And since the lease was solely in my name, the apartment situation was incredibly straightforward. For the first time since I had known Violet, she looked genuinely caught off guard. Not angry yet, just confused. Like the conversation had suddenly moved into territory she did not expect and could not control. The confusion on Violet's face lasted maybe 15 seconds. Then it turned into blistering anger. She crossed her arms and looked around the apartment again, like she was expecting her things to suddenly reappear from behind the sofa. When they obviously did not, she turned back to me and started raising her voice. She asked if I had seriously packed up her entire life while she was at work like some kind of psycho. I stayed seated and kept my tone perfectly normal. I told her nothing about it was sudden or crazy. The conversation we had a few nights earlier had been pretty clear. She said I was not husband material and that I was basically practice. I simply took that information seriously and acted on it. Violet laughed, but it was the irritated, panicked kind of laugh people use when they realize they've lost control of the narrative. She said it was obviously a joke, and that normal people do not cancel weddings and move their fiancé out over one sarcastic comment. That part actually answered a lot for me. To her, the cruel comment meant nothing. It was just a game. To me, it meant everything. It was a revelation of her true character. I explained that the wedding was already canceled and the deposits were handled earlier in the week. I told her the ring was also taken care of. That was when she looked down at her hand. Violet had taken the engagement ring off at the bakery earlier that morning because she did not like getting flour and dough in the setting. She kept it in a small zippered pouch inside her work bag during shifts. When she realized the ring situation had already been financially handled too, the anger shifted again. Now she started saying I was massively overreacting because of Gabriel. She said she had told me 100 times that Gabriel was just a friend. She said that confident men do not panic and destroy their lives over their fiancé having male friends. I let her talk until she ran out of things to say. Then I stood up. I told her the apartment situation was simple. The lease was mine and the engagement was officially over. Her belongings were already at a location she clearly felt very comfortable visiting, which meant there was absolutely no reason for her to stay here anymore. At that point, Violet finally understood what was actually happening. She stared at me for a long moment, the color draining from her face, and asked if I was seriously kicking her out. I nodded. I told her she needed to grab whatever small things she still had in her work bag and head over to Gabriel's place. Her boxes were already waiting there. For the first time since she walked in the door, Violet did not have a sarcastic response ready. She stood there for a moment like her brain was trying to catch up with the reality of the situation. Then the attitude came back one last time. She scoffed and said I was being incredibly dramatic. She kept repeating that I was overreacting. I did not argue about that. Instead, I walked to the front door and opened it. That was when the tone finally changed. Violet asked what I was doing. I told her the conversation was finished. Her belongings were at Gabriel's place, and there was nothing left for her to pack here, which meant the next step was simple. She needed to leave. She stared at the open door like it personally offended her. Then she said something that honestly summed up the entitlement of the entire relationship. She said I could not just kick her out because we were engaged. I reminded her we were not engaged anymore. The wedding had been canceled days earlier. The ring was handled and the lease was in my name alone. She tried another angle. She said she paid half the rent, so legally she lived there too. That part was easy to address. I pulled out my phone and told her I was sending back the pro-rated portion of rent she had already paid for the remaining weeks of the month via Venmo. That way she would not lose a single dollar from leaving early. For a moment, she looked like she was desperately searching her brain for another argument. But there really was not one. Everything was already done. Her belongings were gone. The wedding was gone. The ring was gone. And now the door was open. Violet finally grabbed her work bag from the chair and slung it over her shoulder. She walked toward the doorway slowly, still looking annoyed more than anything else. When she stepped outside into the hallway, she turned around and said something that sounded like a last, weak attempt to regain control of the situation. She said I would regret this once I calmed down and realized what I threw away. I nodded. Then I told her Gabriel's place was only 15 minutes away, so at least the drive would be convenient for her. After that, I closed the door. The apartment was completely quiet. That might sound like a dramatic movie ending moment, but honestly, it just felt incredibly calm. For the first time in months, there was no tension sitting in the background. No passive comments about Gabriel. No little digs about my jealousy or my lack of confidence. Just silence. I made another cup of coffee and sat back down at the kitchen table. About 20 minutes later, my phone started vibrating. Violet. I let it ring. Then it rang again. Then a third time. After the fourth call, she switched to texting. The first message asked if I was seriously doing this. The second one said I needed to stop acting crazy and open the door so we could talk like adults. The third message was just a long, frantic paragraph explaining that she had only been joking the other night, and that I took it out of context. I read them all, but did not respond. About 10 minutes later, another message came through. This one was different. Apparently, Violet had driven over to Gabriel's townhouse and found her boxes sitting inside his entryway, exactly where I left them. The message said I had deeply embarrassed her by dragging Gabriel into our argument. That part almost made me laugh out loud. For months, she had been dragging Gabriel into our relationship without seeing any problem with it. But suddenly, it was a massive embarrassment when he was involved in the ending of it. A few minutes later, another text came in. This time, she said Gabriel was incredibly confused about what was going on and kept asking her questions she did not want to answer. Again, I did not reply. The messages slowed down later that evening. Around 8 p.m., my phone buzzed again, but this time it was not Violet. It was Gabriel. That alone told me things at his place had probably become extremely uncomfortable. His message was actually pretty short. He asked if everything was all right, and said Violet showed up at his place with a bunch of boxes and a story that did not make much sense. I thought about ignoring it, but Gabriel had not really done anything directly to me. As far as I could tell, most of the weird dynamic came from Violet constantly keeping him around as some kind of comparison point to make herself feel desired. So I gave him a simple, factual answer. I told him the engagement was over, and that Violet would probably need somewhere to stay for a while. I said her belongings were already at his place, so the situation should be straightforward for them to figure out. He replied a few minutes later, asking if Violet and I had some kind of massive argument about him. I kept the response short again. I said it was not really about him specifically. It was about how Violet talked about the relationship and what she expected from it. After that, Gabriel sent one last message that honestly sounded more confused and panicked than anything else. He said he thought Violet and I were rock solid, and that she never mentioned any serious problems between us to him. That part did not surprise me at all. Violet liked presenting things in a way that made her look completely reasonable and perfect. If something uncomfortable happened, it usually got framed as someone else being insecure or dramatic. From his perspective, this whole situation probably looked like it appeared out of nowhere. But from mine, it had been building for months. I told him I did not expect him to take sides, and that the only reason I brought the boxes to his place was because Violet spent so much time there already anyway. After that, he simply replied with one word: understood. About 10 minutes later, Violet tried calling again. This time, I turned my phone off completely. At that point, the conversation was finished as far as I was concerned. The apartment was quiet again, and for the first time in a while, my future felt uncomplicated. The next morning, I turned my phone back on. It had 12 missed calls and a long list of messages waiting. Most of them were from Violet. I made coffee first and read them slowly while sitting at the same kitchen table where everything started to fall apart a few days earlier. The tone of her messages had shifted wildly overnight. The earlier ones were angry and sarcastic. Those were followed by a few desperate attempts to explain that she had just been teasing me about the husband material comment. According to her, I had blown a simple joke completely out of proportion and ruined our lives over it. Then, the last few messages changed again. Now she wanted to meet in public and talk things through calmly. She wrote, "Adults fix problems instead of throwing away relationships over pride." I read all of it without responding. Around 9 o'clock a.m., another message came through. This one was short and very revealing. Violet said Gabriel told her he was not comfortable being in the middle of whatever was going on between us. Apparently, he made it clear she could stay a couple of nights on his couch if needed, but he did not want to be dragged into the situation or be seen as the reason for a broken engagement. That detail honestly made sense from his perspective. He woke up to find his ex-fiancee's belongings stacked in his entryway, and a confused conversation about a broken engagement he never saw coming. Reality had hit the fantasy, and the fantasy didn't survive. I finished my coffee and finally sent one single reply. I told Violet there was absolutely nothing left to talk about. The wedding had already been canceled. The engagement was over. Her belongings were safe. I confirmed I had transferred back the prorated portion of rent she had paid, so everything stayed financially fair. A few minutes later, she responded. She asked if I was really ending a 3-year relationship over one sarcastic sentence. I thought about that question for a moment. Then I answered honestly. It was not about one sentence. It was about the meaning behind it. When someone tells you that you are not husband material and that you are basically practice, while keeping their ex comfortably in the background of the relationship, they are telling you exactly how they see you. I just chose to believe you the first time. After that, I blocked the number. The apartment stayed quiet, and for the first time since the engagement started, my life felt like it was moving in a direction that actually made sense. If you found value in this story, hit the like button and share it with someone who might need a reminder to trust their gut and protect their peace. Don't forget to subscribe to Story Siren for more stories about setting unbreakable boundaries. Until next time.